You're listening to the Better Two podcast with DM Needom. Hi, gang. Donna here. Thanks for tuning into the Better Two podcast. Today's guest is Edward Gangi. Edward has a very interesting story. When he turned 70, he decided to dig into his past. When he was about 7 or 8, he was what the term would be called back then, piking, digging through some documents of his parents. And he found out by searching that he was adopted. Now, in this day and age, we would have ran into the living room and said, "What's this?" But back then, you couldn't. And as I discussed in the podcast, you would have been told, "Why were you digging?" They would have avoided the question and asked why you were digging. So he just let it go. And he let his adoptive parents take the secret to the grave. While he had documentation and other paperwork to help him on his journey, he was happy with the life he had. But at the age of 70, he decided, well, let me do some digging. And that's what he did. And he takes us on this journey that ended up allowing him to write a book called The Gift Best Given, a memoir. And it's about his mom, his birth mom, and her journey, and his journey of discovery. So I hope you enjoy the show. This episode of the Better Two podcast is brought to you by Kitty Mystic and DM Needom, author of My Days with the Dark Muse, as well as Love is Worth Waiting For. Hi, Edward. How are you doing?
Doing well, Donna. Thank you. How are you?
I'm doing good.
Good.
So how's the weather where you are? It looks a little bit sunny over here. It's kind of overcast and foggy.
Yeah, it's not too bad today. It's in the 50s. It just turned a little bit gray. It was sunny this morning, but we've got nothing to complain about here in North Carolina.
You know, usually in December, I would sit there and say it's really super cold, but it was like 50 for Christmas. And we've had no snow.
Crazy weather.
Yeah. So it's kind of a bizarre year. But we didn't come
You're in Chicago, aren't you?
I am about 80 miles northwest of it,
Okay.
But yeah.
North and west. Okay, so you even get more weather.
Yeah, I'm about 8 miles from Wisconsin. So
all right.
Yeah, a little bit over and there's the cheddar curtain for you. So, as they call it. They actually do not use salt. They use cheese brine, allegedly, for the roads instead of using salt.
I had never heard that, but it makes sense, I guess.
I guess so. I don't know. I mean, I just live up here. I'm a transplant from the South. So, what can I say?
And we went from the north to the south, so we're happy to be where we are.
I think that happens to us. I think as we age, we kind of go, okay, where do we want to go, and find a nice little place to call home. So I like the summers up here. They're not as hot and it's not as humid. So that's typically why I chose here. But
I'm sure
we didn't come here to talk about that. We came here to talk about your journey and how nearing your 70th birthday, you decided, I want to dig into my life. Which is a very brave thing.
I didn't think about it as a brave thing back then, but it certainly peeled away a lot of layers that you never think about.
So tell us about what led up to this event.
Well, the story was that I was adopted at the time of my birth. I was taken home by my adoptive parents at a day old. And as you said, until I was 70 years old, I had never dug in. My adoptive parents, never, to the best of my recollection, told me that I was adopted. So it was never a matter of discussion. But I had come across a piece of paperwork in their file cabinet one day that made it very clear that I was. But my thought process was, if they weren't talking about it, then I guess I probably shouldn't ask about it. And I really didn't have a reason. I had a great childhood and great family experience. So I just both of them took the secret, if it was intended to be a secret, to the grave. And it was probably 30 years since my mother passed away that finally there was an event that kind of triggered my curiosity and said, let's go for it.
When did you find that piece of paper?
Oh, I was probably somewhere, I'm guessing 7, 8, 9 years old. And, it was, I, I was born in New York City, and New York City had issued birth certificates which showed the adoptive parents' names, but not the birth parents. And it listed me as male child Norowski, which turned out to be my birth mother's name.
Okay. Wow. So that's a pretty heady thing to take on, being that young. But I mean, times were definitely different. So you didn't question. I mean, nowadays, if a kid found that, I'm sure a kid would walk into their parents and go,
They'd be shaking.
yeah, yeah. Back then, you would have brought that. They would have just been like, "What were you doing digging?" That would have been
exactly right.
It would have
and
been.
You're right. It was a very different era. They in adoption circles they call it the baby scoop era. And, it's where moms got sent away to their maiden aunts on the other side of the country and, told everybody, the family said, oh, she's just going out there to go to school or going to visit. And, she'd have her baby. The baby would be taken from her and she'd get sent home.
Yeah.
And everything was just a secret at that point.
And I think there's still some avenues that people want that to remain secret, because I had a situation back in the early 2000s where somebody wanted me to do that. I wasn't an aunt or anything, but somebody wanted me to do that for somebody. And it was just like, because what's going to end up happening is when that person gets to a certain age, they're going to want their baby back. And I'm not doing that. So, So
no, it's interesting. I ultimately wound up writing a book about my search and about the woman who I found out was my birth mother. And that just opened up all these conversations with people who, suddenly revealed, gee, I was adopted, or gee, I gave a child up for adoption. And they were people you'd not expect. But, there are lots of secrets out there. Some of them were great results, but some of them have a lot of pain attached to them.
There's an episode of the podcast, which you may have listened to, about a gentleman who was adopted, and he ended up feeling very isolated and not belonging at a certain point. And he had a lot to work through. I have 3 cousins that are adopted, and I found out, I think it was about 10 or 11 when I found out, because their father had passed. And it wasn't that I needed to know this, but my mother had a way of telling me the truth when she shouldn't. So that was just kind of her snarky way of saying, well, that wasn't their dad anyway.
Right.
Thanks. Okay. But it's still their father. I mean,
yeah.
But so tell us more about, so you go at 70, you decide, okay, I'm going to do this. And so you start on this journey. And I mean, now that we have the internet and we have Ancestry, I'm sure this made the search a scotch easier.
Well, yeah, I was blessed, number one, that I still had that piece of paper. My parents passed that, those files on to myself and subsequently to my wife when we got married. And I knew that piece of paper was there for years, and I just never went back to it because I just never had that burning urge. But we were up in New Jersey, and we were at a cemetery up there. My wife's father had passed away, and we were there for the interment. And nearby was another cemetery, which was in what had been a very, very heavily Ukrainian community in its time. And it had a quite large cemetery where my adoptive mother had several family members buried. And we were up there, and I was standing over her parents' grave. And something just sort of nudged me, and it said, well, it'd be interesting to kind of track down more information about them. So when we got back from New Jersey, I went to our local library, and they had Ancestry.com, as you suggested. And I started pumping in information about them that I was familiar with. And I started getting a fairly significant amount of information coming back to me. And, for the first time, I kind of sat there and said, well, if it's this easy, I wonder what would happen if I put in my birth mother's name. So, I hustled myself home, and I went back to make sure I had the right name. And I went back to the library, put it in, and, all of a sudden I had this big screen of information appear in front of me. And, there were birth records and there were census records. And then it's just a matter of which one do you choose to click on and see what comes up. Yeah. And as you suggest, number one, I was fortunate or facilitated by the internet and by Ancestry. And I was doubly fortunate to have a name to start with. Yeah. Many adoptees don't have that. And so I had this access to a flood of different pieces of information there.
So you get the information. Was your mom still alive?
No, as it turned out, and this took quite some time to determine who she really was, because she changed her birth name to a stage name, and it turned out that she was a celebrity performer in the big ice skating shows in the 1940s and 1950s. So, but I didn't know that she had adopted that name. It took some time to sort that out. And then she complicated it by 7 years after my birth, getting married and adopting her husband's name. So I had a lot of searching to do to kind of funnel down on those, on where she was under which name. And when I finally did find out who she was and where she was or had been, I found out that she had passed away in 2014, and my search was taking place in 2017. So I didn't miss by an awful lot.
Yeah. So what did you get out of it? I mean, you found out your mom was a celebrated ice skater. Did you find out why she gave you up? Did you find out any of this other information? I know it's in the book. But...
Yeah, well, I found out a lot of things, and I had some great moments. First thing I found out, and this is kind of fluffy sounding, but you find out how generous and how good people can be. I found lots of people I found people who had known my mother. And when I reached out to them, they could not have been any more forthcoming and any kinder in providing information and providing insights and wanting me to know who my mother had been. And I think another gift that I certainly found was, I found a maternal half brother.
Nice.
Still alive. There was a second brother who under very unfortunate circumstances was no longer alive. And in the process of the search, I had also submitted a DNA sample to Ancestry, just wanting to know what my ethnicity truly was. And, and that sample came back after I had been doing a good bit of research and had discovered a number of things. But it came back and revealed a name that I didn't recognize at all as a first cousin or closer. And there's not much closer than a first cousin.
No.
And by that time I knew all the names on my mother's side. So I was able to reach out to this person and through a little bit of discussion and analysis, determined that he was my half brother, my paternal half brother.
Wow.
And he was able to tell me about my father. And I think the takeaway there was my father probably never knew about me. Yeah. He didn't know that my mother had left town pregnant. She probably didn't know until she was well out of town. And again, on the kindness side, we went out to visit him and I met his mother, who at the time was 96 years old. And she married him after I was conceived. But she said, "Sit down. I want to tell you about your father." Wow. And she just wanted to share what she thought would be important to me to know about him, to know about his own upbringing and what shaped him as a person.
Well, and also some of the benefit of this is, I mean, granted, you're an older person, you also get the family history aspect, you get the medical history aspect, which most people don't even biological kids don't think of it. I mean, my mom died when I was
Yeah.
in my 20s, and I didn't even think to say, well, I should get her medical records and I should look at what her medical history is. You don't think
No,
about those
that's
things.
absolutely true. No, you don't. And I went through all of my life with, you'd go for a checkup and the doctor would walk into the room and ask, do your parents have this? Do your parents have that? And yeah, shrug your shoulders and say, no, I'm adopted. And you don't have that history. And, my mother came, she was the youngest of three sisters, and there was an older brother. And both of her sisters passed away from cancer.
Mm.
Yeah, my birth mother lost her breast to cancer, but that was not the cause of her death. But yeah, it's stuff that's important to know. You don't know
Like
where it's passed down, but it's valuable.
yeah. And I mean, it's one of those things where if you lose a parent when you're younger, you don't think about it. If you're adopted, you don't have those answers. And it's always that awkward conversation because, for me, my mom committed suicide. So people are like, the doctor's like, so family history, mother deceased. And I try to
Right.
leave it at that. But over the years, of course, they're not going to, that's not an acceptable answer.
No longer.
So then you have to give the answer. And then they look at you like, well, and it's like, no, I'm not her. She had a lot of issues.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, for you, it's got to be just that awkward silence as well of, well, and of course, now that you're older, I don't know that they're focused on that as much as when you're younger. But
Yeah, they still ask the questions. As you hit your certain place, you're right. It probably becomes a little less critical.
so,
But when you get the questions about, is there a family history of dementia, things like that,
yeah.
it's at this age that becomes an important question.
Yeah. And here's the thing though, you can have both parents living and, my dad's health did not become an issue until he hit 70, and then he had a heart attack and stroke. But they didn't talk about that. My dad's health was always, if he asked him how he was doing, I'm fine. How's your blood pressure? Fine. Okay. Well, you're not really, I mean, and this is what I guess I'm going into this is because if you have kids, don't sit there and just say, I'm fine, because your kids really need to know the medical history of you because
Sure.
it affects them ultimately. They're a half of you. So, did you have any kids?
We have one grown son. He's now 31 years old.
And what did he think about you going on this journey?
He's kind of he doesn't show his cards, very openly. He's quiet, he's reserved, he's very thoughtful. I think he was curious about it. He has traveled with me to go and visit my maternal half brother. There's a whole story involved with finally interring her remains, 5-6 years after her passing. He traveled with us out to California and met my paternal half brother, met his mom. So yeah, he's been a part of that journey, and I think he's found it very interesting. I guess he finds it interesting from the impact on me. I don't think he sees any real strong impact on him at this point.
So you said it took five years after to intern her?
Yeah, it's this kind of it's a little bit of a crazy story. I find it took some time. I determined that the younger of the two half brothers was no longer alive. I determined that the older one was, and using the internet, I found an address and I sent off a carefully handwritten letter. And back then, what I was doing is I was sending letters to people I was kind of trying to get information from, just saying I'm exploring a possible family relationship. Because you get all sorts of crazy mail and people are very suspect of it. And the letter came back. It was, not known at this address. So I went back to the internet and I looked for another address, and I found a post office box somewhere. And And same thing came back, user no longer at this post office. And I found still a third one and couldn't make a connection. But then by this point, I knew what my birth mother's stage and married names had been. And I started to Google under those, and I found a couple down in Marietta, Georgia, and they were pickers. They're people involved with antiques, but they would go out and they would look for small items that they could resell. But, she had purchased a carton of memorabilia at an auction that had belonged to my mother. Oh, wow. These were publicity photographs and a photo album and news clippings, things like that. She had no idea who the woman was, but she just thought it was kind of a glamorous age. So on her blog, she posted some pictures. And, so in the course of Googling, I came across this blog, and it's like, holy cow, there's 6 pictures of my mother, her copy of her first professional contract. And so I searched this woman out, and she was very responsive. And I figured, okay, they're in the antiques business. She had purchased these several years before. I said, there's not a chance that she still has them. But as the case would be, yes, she did have them.
Okay.
And, so we made arrangements to go and visit with them. But at the bottom of the blog was a, comment section. And somebody who had known my birth mother and her family had made the comment saying, yes, I knew them. And I went to school with the 2 sons, and we lived down the street from the parents. And, so I got in touch with him, and, he got back to me and said, well, your brother was in a calamitous fire and had been terribly burned in 2015 on New Year's Eve, as a matter of fact, and had been in the hospital for a prolonged stay and was now in a rehab facility. He said, I will try to reach out to him. And as a matter of fact, he didn't identify him as my half-brother at that point because I didn't tell him that's who he was. And he said, but this is where he is. And he said, I'll try to get him in touch with you. And it took some time, and I didn't get a call. So I went back and got with him again. He said, okay. He said, I'll make sure he calls. And he did. And I explained to him about who I was. And he had a very hard time getting his head around it.
Oh, I imagine.
He just kept on saying, okay, now tell me again, what kind of kin are we? And I would explain. I said, we have the same mother. We had different fathers. And he just wasn't grasping it or not, just wasn't resonating with him. But over the course of time, we did clarify that, we were half brothers. And while this had been going on, I was contacting cemeteries in Georgia, trying to see if I could find out where she was buried. And nobody had any clue. I found a lady who was a commissioner for one of the town cemeteries, and she said, well, I'll reach out to all the towns around us. And again, she was very kind, trying to search it out. And she came back and said, I'm sorry, she's not buried any place that we can identify. So I finally asked my half brother, I said, where was our mother buried? And he said, well, she wasn't. I said, okay. I said, where are her remains? She's in the closet with Daddy's remains. Now, I knew that Daddy had died in 1994.
Wow. So
this was 25 years.
Yeah.
And I was happy that the remains were someplace and had been preserved. I think the issue was at that time was just financial.
Yeah.
And so when his dad had passed away, there was access to the resources to bury him. Why it didn't happen, I don't know. But they kept the ashes. When his mother passed away, our mother, he was kind of on a tight budget, and I assumed just couldn't afford it. And so we spent some time, and I let a little bit of time go by, and then I made some calls to local cemeteries to find out what it would cost to inter the remains for both of them.
Nice.
And we finally I found a place which made sense, and I so very delicately, told him. I said, "Well, I've been in touch with the cemetery, in such and such a place, and they have some options. And would you be open to that?" And he was very excited about it. He's very relieved, I think. So we got that done. I think a humorous story is when my wife and I would go there to visit. We've probably been there 4 or 5 times now. In the middle of this little Georgia town is a very elegant and sophisticated restaurant. And so we sort of made a date night, just she and I, and we would go to the restaurant. And we had our own waiter who we had encountered on a few of those visits. And we were there the night before the interment. And he came out and he went to one of the adjacent tables and brought out this kind of little fancy dessert. And everybody seemed surprised by it. And a little while after that, he brought one to another table and they seemed very surprised. And he came over and he said, "You know what? I didn't even think to ask you." He said, "Are you here for a special event?" And my wife and I kind of looked at each other. And my wife looked at him and she said, "Well, Ed's mother is coming out of the closet tomorrow." and the waiter he's kind of a flamboyantly gay type. Mm-hmm. And he just put his hands on his waist and said, "Well, I'm down with that." And he went hustling off to the kitchen. By the time he came back with a little pastry, "Congrats on coming out of the closet." And the kitchen staff was out there kind of peeking. The bartender was looking over the top, So it was really kind of cute. And the next day, we had a Catholic priest there to perform a little bit of a ceremony. The person who would put me in touch with my brother was there. My brother's wife, who was also in a rehab facility, was there. That's where they had met. And, so we formalized it. And at least the two of them are now, they're out of the closet and they're in a place where they should be.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, which most people don't realize, even cremation costs a lot. When I went dealing with taking care of my husband was a larger guy. So if you have a life insurance policy, you can go to a funeral home. And a funeral home now, this was as of June of 2020, and this is in a small town, wanted to charge me $3,000 to just cremate him. There's a cremation society in Illinois that I was told about, and it's a no-frill thing. And it normally would have cost me about $600. But because my husband was a larger guy, it ended up costing me about $8.
Yeah.
But it's amazing. And they're like, "Well, we can get the death certificate for you. It's $20 a pop." Okay, I can go down to the courthouse and get it myself for $10. And it's just amazing how in that moment you're so grief stricken that, I hate to say it, people are willing to take advantage.
Right.
Especially if your loved one has not planned these things.
Well, when my wife's father passed away, it was the same issue. We went to one funeral home and it was a multi-$1,000 event. And we finally went to another and it was very much the same thing. I think it was $500 or $600. And, and you can pick your urn, and some of these urns are, terribly expensive. And, we found one that was kind of a faux marble and it was $100. And, and that's how we carried him through the Philadelphia airport when we went to the cemetery.
Yeah. I mean,
but it's expensive, and you're right. It's an emotional time and people just tend to nod their head. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And there's an episode of the TV show called Lucifer, and he shows up at a wake. And the people are mortified, and he's a human, but I don't know if you've seen Lucifer, but he's a human.
Yeah, I haven't.
But he is Lucifer. He is the devil, but he's walking the earth, and it's not a biblical show. But anyway, he walks into this funeral and he's helping the police department, and he says, all these people are there. He's like, "Look, you're not here This is not for him. He's dead. He's not here. This is for you. So, and it's a very true statement. People don't realize that the expense you're putting out, and I'm not saying it's wrong because you're going there to grieve. And I've spent this whole event grieving by myself, but you go there to grieve as a group. But is it really, couldn't you just do that by having something at your house?
Absolutely.
Without the cost?
Yeah. Yeah, we've been one extreme to the other. We've been, we buried my mother and her husband, went to a Mexican restaurant after that and had a couple of beers. By the same token, we've been to a couple of big Italian funerals where people were entombed in mausoleums and the price of the crypt depended on what the view was.
Yeah.
And then went to a very elegant and extravagant meal afterwards. And, you're right. It's for the people who are left behind, and, they do it for their comfort, or we do it for our comfort, I guess.
I remember when my grandfather died, so I was 12 or close to being 12. And I remember they had to go pick a plot out in the cemetery. And my grandmother was saying, well, he's by a tree and there's a wooded area. Now there's not a wooded area. They've developed that area. Mm-hmm. But because he liked to hunt, my grandmother thought, oh, well, this is a really good spot for him because he liked to hunt. Okay. But, you don't think, I guess she didn't think about the reality of that being eventually developed or anything like that.
Right.
It's one of those things where he's not going to enjoy this.
Not likely.
No, but it's just amazing that when you're going through grief, your mind starts going to weird places.
I think, you think those things to comfort yourself.
Yeah. My grandmother, when my mom died and we cremated her, she started talking about how it most likely hurt her to be cremated. But yet, I said, so because since my mother passed, I was now responsible for her. And I said, okay, so what would you like done? Well, I want to be cremated. Okay. No, I don't want to be cremated. Okay. I want you to donate my body to science. Okay. Then she found out that they do all sorts of things. No, I don't want my body donated to science. Do you want to be buried with grandfather? No. Well, maybe, but no, I want to be cremated. Okay. So ultimately, I ended up donating tissue for burn victims. I ended up having her cremated. I spread some of her ashes with my grandfather's grave. I spread some of her ashes with my mom. Actually, most of them went with where my mom was. And then I have just a little bit left as a tribute to her.
Yeah.
But and the funny thing was, it was storming in New Orleans the whole time. And when we went and finally finished the ash release, the sun came out for about 10 minutes. And my husband just looked at me and said, she's happy with what you did. And then it started raining again.
Yep.
Like, okay.
Yeah, it's funny. I believe in some of those things. Some of it just sounds good and it makes us feel better.
Yeah. So do you have an ongoing, has all of this, all your adventure here is digging into this. I know you wrote a book and that had to be liberating to be able to put this whole journey on paper. But have you gotten more out of it? Do you still see your half brother? Do you still keep in touch with anybody that, either half brother?
Yeah, actually, well, I'm thinking Christmas Eve day, I spoke with my paternal half brother out in California. We stay in touch, probably not as frequently as I do with my maternal half brother, but part of that is him too. He's got kind of a smaller circle, so he depends on the contact. Yesterday was his birthday, so we've been missing each other. We've been playing phone tag, but probably after I'm off here, I'll give him a call again. But we probably talk every couple of weeks or so. If it was up to him, we'd talk every night. But we talk pretty frequently. In the process, I discovered some cousins on my mother's side. And, I got a text from one yesterday just wishing us a Merry Christmas with a picture of he and his wife and his daughter. And, actually before the pandemic, we had spent my last two birthdays with he and his wife.
Nice.
which was nice. There's a cousin up in Vermont who I've not yet met, but he was one of the earliest people to really fill me in on things. And after we talked, he said, I'm going to go and see, I think I've got some photos. And one day this big fat envelope of family photographs showed up and had pictures of my mother from the time she was 4 years old.
Wow.
And so it's again, people have been so generous and so embracing, but it's turned out to be a reflection on her. She was a good person who was loved by a lot of people, and they paid it back.
So I have to ask, let's go back to the antique dealer. So she still had the stuff. Did you end up buying the stuff, or did you what happened with that?
Well, it was interesting, my wife, and I've said this before, and then the woman's name is Toby, and she's a wonderful woman. And so is her husband, just ultimately generous. But, when I finally made contact with her, and I sent her one of those possible family relationship messages, and she sent a message back saying, I'm kind of busy now, but yes, I've got it. I'll call you back when I've got time. And it was over a week and I didn't hear anything. And I was getting kind of antsy at that point. So I sent her another message saying, that woman is my mother. I would really like to talk to you. And within 5 minutes, she called me and said, oh my God, I can't believe I forgot to call you. She said, you need to come here now. Yeah, so we're in North Carolina. She's in Georgia. Probably within a week, though, we drove down there. And along the way, my wife and I had the conversation of, okay, if she's willing to sell the stuff, what are we willing to pay for it? And when we got there, we had a great 2-3 hour meeting with she and her husband at our hotel. And in going through the box, there were a stack of publicity photos of other skaters that she skated with, all personalized to her. And I started writing down names, thinking, I'll go and I'll research. Maybe I can find one who's still alive and she could tell me something. And Toby's husband, Dan, said, what are you doing? He was just kind of perplexed. And I explained, and he just sort of shook his head. And, he said, you don't need to write it down. He said, this all belongs to you. We've just been holding it for you.
Wow.
And they just kind of pushed it across the table. And it was their gift to me.
Wow.
And that was just symbolic of everything that's happened along this journey. Interestingly, I researched, I talk about it in the book, but I researched those names, and just owing to their ages, most of the women, either I couldn't find or they were deceased. Yeah. But I found an obituary I was looking for one particular woman, and I found an obituary for her husband. And that didn't help me a lot, but it gave me the names of 2 sons. And I made contact with one of the sons, and again, I think by this point I wasn't coy. I just wrote, your mom and my mom skated together in 1947. And just curious if your mom is still alive. And I sent a copy of the picture of his mother. Mm-hmm. And a couple of days later, he called back and he said, Mom is alive. I showed her the picture. She's really excited. She would like to talk to you.
Wow.
And I said, well, that's great. He said, I just need to warn you, though, she's in a memory care facility.
Oh.
I said, uh-oh. And he had to hear the pause. And he said, the good thing is, the bad thing is she doesn't know what she had for breakfast today.
But
the good thing is she remembers every minute of 1947. Yeah. And she and I had a great telephone call. We were on the phone for over an hour.
Nice.
And then in September of 2017, my wife went to Minneapolis to visit her. And we spent the better part of 5 hours with her. And she still had her photo albums and stuff. We had a great time. We'd gone out to lunch, and she was disappointed that her son discouraged her from having a cocktail. And I, in retrospect, I should have ordered one myself, and she would have, then everything would have been good. But yeah, interesting story was, and she was my mother's roommate in 1947.
Okay.
And she told me lots of things. The one thing she didn't know, she didn't realize my mother had gotten pregnant. And, and she had no idea who my father would have been. Yeah, but all those things revealed themselves a little bit later.
And your mom went to live with her sister, correct?
She actually came back to New York when she discovered she was pregnant. And she wound up in a sublet apartment in New York City. Never told her parents. The only person she shared with was her eldest sister and her sister's husband. And when I met my cousins, my first question was, "Did you know?" And both of the cousins had exactly the same response: was, "No, we didn't know. And if anyone in the family knew, the whole family would have known."
Yeah.
So her sister and the husband kept it a real tight secret.
Yeah, I mean, the things I joke because the spelling of my last name was changed. I found that out when I was when Hal Needom, I think it was Cannonball Run, had come out or something like that, and I saw Needom and I'm like, "Are we related?" And then the conversation goes to, "Well, yeah, but something happened." Okay, and your great grandfather did something and he changed the spelling of the last name. Okay, yeah. Well, tell me what happened. Don't know. Nobody talks about it. Okay.
That's the tough part is, families have so much history and either no one asks the questions, so no one offers the information, or someone will ask the questions and, and then people say, "No, I don't want to talk about it." Yeah. There's so much out there. People really need to talk.
I was in my 40s and I had gone back home to take my grandmother to a place because my dad couldn't take her to go check out this new place to live. This was after Katrina. And so I'm in the car, I'm driving to Mississippi to take her to go look this. She's going to go stay at a place near my cousin's. And I'm on the phone with my uncle and somehow we get into the conversation. He's like, "Well, your dad was emancipated." I'm like, "What? What are you talking about?" And I mean, I'm in my 40s. I have no idea. And my dad is still alive. I'm like, "What are you talking about?" "Yeah, your dad emancipated himself."
Huh.
Okay. My dad still hasn't really told me about it. But my uncle's like, "Yeah, he did." I'm like, no reasoning. Just here you go.
Yeah, a lot of these stories, I guess, they surround events that were not happy in people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
But there's still important things to know.
Yeah. I mean, not that it changes anything really, but it explains why my grandmother, his mom, didn't go to my parents' wedding. This explains things in a bigger picture. Right. The only thing that doesn't make any sense, though, is they got married when he was 18. So I don't understand why. There had to be more to it, but I'll never know. My dad's not going to tell me. So I'll never know.
You got to get it.
Go ahead.
Let's say you've got to get him drinking one day.
No. That would not reveal. No. And now he can't. But no, he just. When it comes to talking about it, it was interesting because when my grandmother passed, so his mom, because his dad was already gone, the family she had 3 kids. He has a half sister, and then his uncle, and then my dad. And there's cousins all over, and I had a half sister. Well, my half sister, who's 12 years removed from me, didn't want any family pictures, and my dad didn't want any family pictures. So I got all the family pictures. I'm like, all right, whatever. And he was telling my stepmom was telling me, "Well, your dad doesn't have any family pictures. Your dad doesn't. He didn't have any, good memories from being a kid."
Right.
I'm like, "But I have family pictures." "What? I want to see them." Okay. I mean, it was just a very surreal thing that I think we kind of isolate ourselves sometimes if the past is bad. The thing is, and I did this week, is you have to actually go back and look at that and reframe it. Because I think when we're younger, we put things in our mind to protect ourselves. We don't look at the situation fully. Where we, as an adult, we can go back and go, okay. Because I'm sure if you would have dug into this, let's just say when you were 8 or 9, if you started really thinking about this, your mind would have wondered, why did this happen to me?
Right.
But as an older person, you're like, I had a good life, And now I have a bonus life.
Yeah, I had those occasional passing thoughts, but it's it was more just intellectual curiosity than gee, I got hurt by this, and But, that thought would pass. My thought was, okay, probably my mom was probably a high school girl, stayed out late late one night and came home with a problem. And I had a picture of, I seldom thought about my father, but I figured he was some, gas pump jockey at the local gas station. And, and it could not have turned out any differently than it did. And probably better now to know the whole story.
So who was you don't have to give him a name, but what was your dad? Was he a gas pump jockey?
No. At the time I was conceived, my mother was skating with the Ice Follies. And Ice Follies was a touring company that toured from September of every year through June of the next year. And then they would summer over in San Francisco. And during the day, they would rehearse the coming year's season. And at night, they would perform for paying audiences the past year's show. So, he turned out to be an insurance investigator who somehow had ties to some of the people at Ice Follies. So my assumption is these were just two people who passed. He was a pretty good-looking guy. She was obviously a very good-looking woman. And I came out of a summer romance. And I think it was just a casual romance. One of the very interesting things that I found, when my brother and I made contact, my maternal half-brother, he had all of my mother's memorabilia, and she kept wonderful photo albums, all chronologically in order, all labeled with who was in the picture, where it was taken, when it was taken. And, so the first time we were out with him, he was showing me the photo album, and page by page, starting in 1942, there were these little, the black and white brownie snapshots. And and he was still at the point of asking, now, what kind of kin are we? He just wasn't buying it yet.
Yeah.
It was going in chronological order. We got to about 1946. And I said, and I told him, I said, Ted, I was conceived in August of 1947 in San Francisco. That's where your mother was. And he kept on kind of shaking his head. And as he was about to turn the page, I repeated again. I said, August 1947, San Francisco. And he turned the page. And in the midst of this page of black and white snapshots was a color photograph labeled August 1947, San Francisco, California. And that's what I used for the cover of my book.
Nice. And
he looked at it and he didn't say a thing. He just folded up the book and took it away and put it in the other room, came back, said, "You want a beer?" And he just needed time to digest, but it was the final piece that said, okay, what this guy's telling me could be true.
Sometimes we need that one piece of crucial hard evidence to really wrap our head around something.
Yeah. Actually, I gave him a photocopy of my adoption decree.
Okay.
And he looked at it, and his mother's signature was on it clear as day. And and by that time I knew it was for sure her, because I compared it with all sorts of other documents. And he looked at it, and you could tell he knew it too. But he handed it back to me and he said, "No," I said, "You can keep it." I said, "It has really no value. It's a photocopy." And several days later, he called me and he said, "Well, I took that document down to the rehab facility where he had been and where his wife still was." And I said, "Okay, what did you do with it?" He said, "Well, I showed it to so-and-so, who I think was the administrator and somebody he trusted." And I said, "Well, what did you tell him?" He said, "Well, I explained what you told me." And I said, "What did he say?" And he said, "Well, he asked me if that was my mama's signature." "What did you tell him?" He said, "Well, I told him, that's my mama's signature." And I said, "Well, what did he say?" He said, "If that's your mama's signature, it looks like you got yourself a half brother."
Yeah.
And that was the piece that finally made him comfortable and convinced.
I wonder if his dad knew.
You know what? I doubt it. My feeling is that's a secret she carried forever.
Yeah.
Her sister knew, the husband, the sister's husband knew, the people who were in the midst of my helping arrange my adoption knew, but I don't think anybody in the family knew, including her husband.
How long? When did your dad pass?
He passed away, give or take the year 2000 or so. He was older than my mother was.
Okay.
Yeah, she was born in 1926. He was born in 1919. So he's 6, 7 years older.
Any regrets about not trying to pursue this earlier?
Yeah, I'm not a person who lives with a lot of regrets. I think, knowing what the situation was with my mother's later life, my regret is that I didn't have the chance to meet her and to say that you did a good thing, that what you did turned out for the best. And I would like to have done that, because I think any woman who surrenders a child for adoption is making a huge sacrifice. It may be selfish at the time, I don't know, but I think in her case she had options, but she did what she, I think, thought was going to be best for the child involved.
Did she go back to skating after you were born?
Yeah, I was born in May of 1948. She was back touring with an organization called the Ice Fogs by October of the same year. By the next summer, and this was the first document I found, she and Ice Fogs had traveled to South America, and they skated in Rio and Buenos Aires and San Paulo. And, and then a year after that, still with the Ice Fogs, she was skating in Europe for 5 months.
Wow.
So her career continued through early part of 1956. She was already pregnant with my half brother and had slowed her skating substantially, and then retired at that point. She and her husband formed a studio that built props for the big ice shows and other theatrical events, and they continued that business through the middle of the 1990s.
When I was a kid, we used to go see Holiday on Ice.
Uh-huh.
All the time.
Actually, Ice Fogs was the kind of the stepchild of Holiday on Ice. So I think they continued until 1956, and then the two were merged.
Okay. Yeah, that was every year we would go, and even they would do a dog show on the ice. They were a lot of carpet, and I don't know that those things would fly as well. I mean, they still have Sesame Street on ice and stuff, but I don't know if it's the same. And
they do Sesame Street, they do Disney on Ice, and I've written an article to pitch to a local magazine about my mother coming through along with Ice Fogs right in the area where we live now. And, somebody was saying, well, you really need to get somebody in the modern shows to tell you what it's about. And they were two different animals.
Yeah.
The ones today are very high tech. They're geared to young kids. The ones back then were adult entertainment.
Now, back in the early 90s, I took my daughters right after the Olympics to the Campbell Soup Stars on Ice. Now that was pure skating, and that was an incredible show.
Yeah. And Follies was very much that. They had very sophisticated, accomplished skaters, and they had some stuff. They had the two guys coming out skating in a donkey costume, and somebody else would come and juggle, but they would do 6 or 7 very elaborate production numbers with excellent skating involved.
And then you'd always have one comedian that would come out and do. I mean, it was simple entertainment, and it was a way to spend the evening out. Right. When you're watching like the Olympic stars for my kids, it was just kind of like they had watched the Olympics. They were playing ice skaters. They were so hardcore. They wanted ice skate lessons. That didn't fly well, but but they wanted us. And so I went to, when the tickets went on sale, we got front row side of the rink seats. which now that we couldn't have afforded that, but then you could. But it was a whole adventure because we were living in a small town and you had to drive up to Indianapolis to see them. So we're an hour away. So this was just a big adventure.
It's an outing.
And then I said, so do you really want to meet them? And because I had met bands and stuff. And they're like, yeah. I said, okay, this is what we're going to do. And so we left right after the encore and ran to where the bus was. And I'm carrying one of them. And they got to meet Christy Yamaguchi and Nancy Kerrigan. And they got to see a couple other people, but we didn't take pictures or anything. But Christy Yamaguchi was just a sweetheart. The camera camera didn't go off the flash, and she was just so patient and everything. Nancy,
and your kids will always remember that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it was a fun time. And
yeah,
there's an artistry to ice skating.
Oh, sure there is.
And I don't think people realize that.
Yeah, quite by accident. I think it was Christmas Eve that we did it. You know, my wife said, do you want to watch a movie? And I had this Casablanca thing in my head. And, you know, unless you pay for it, you can't watch Casablanca. So we just started going through old classic Netflix movies. And there's a movie called Ice Follies 1939. And if anyone has any interest in ice skating, it really is. It's an interesting thing. And we watched that. It was the first time I had seen it. But, you know, they had one act in this. Yeah, it's a story, but with ice skating scenes in it. And one of the pairs skating were the first people that my mother professionally skated with in the 1940s. Wow. Says it was really interesting. And it's interesting how if you expose yourself to something long enough, you become somewhat expert in that. Yeah. In that field. So I'm sort of pointing to people on the on the TV screen, and it's like, oh yeah, I know them. We know them, and sort of knowing all the perspective with them.
So really this journey has opened up a whole different life for you as far as, the expert ice skating advisor, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
But I mean, you've gotten siblings from it. Now, here's another question though for you. You wrote a book. So
I did.
Is there a chance, now that you wrote this, and then granted it's not a fictional tale, has the author in you been inspired to write anything else besides the magazine article or newspaper article?
I have. I've actually started a second book, and the pandemic has just kind of taken the oomph out of me with writing. But I've started recently, and I'm 4,000 or 5,000 words into it. My mother came back to, once she and her husband married, they moved down into the Atlanta area. And her family still remained in New York City, her sisters and brother and parents. And so she got back on occasion, but in 1962, there was a 50th anniversary party for her parents and a 25th anniversary for the sister and her spouse who had seen her through her pregnancy. So she came back with her two sons, and I'm writing from the perspective of she's gone back to visit number one with the last partner she had as a celebrity performer. He was then in Greenwich Village running an antique store, and then visiting with a woman who appears in the book, the first book, who kind of assumed a maternal figure for her and was kind of a sounding board. And she's going to go and visit with her and kind of talk about, where she is and what's gone through her head in the past, in the 14 intervening years from my birth to her return to New York in 62. Yeah, so my mother had, there are a couple of stories there. That's a light one, but I think there's a potential for, what does a woman go through when she surrenders a child for adoption? Because I don't think it's a give up the child and walk away and forget about it. I think that stays with you forever.
Well, I can answer that question, not personally, but I have a friend who gave up her daughter because her father forced her to give up her daughter at birth. She got pregnant when she was in high school. She now knows her daughter. Her daughter's grown. She got to meet her daughter through the birth parent through the adoptive parents when she was in high school. Mm-hmm. And so she's gotten to see her daughter grow. Her daughter has a grandchild, so she's now a grandmother as well. So she's got that connection. But I've also seen, and this is not regarding adoption, I've seen people that have had an abortion that still wonder,
Yep.
well, my baby would be this at this age. So
Yep.
in a way, whether it's adoption or abortion, the woman that gives up that child is always got that in the back of their head of what would my kid look like? They would be at the same age. And I'm sure that plays out as well for a person that loses a child via miscarriage.
Sure.
It's always one of those things that it affects you at your core. And some people it won't. So, that's human nature. But other people it will.
It's interesting in writing the book, it started out kind of, number one was about my journey. Number two was the unexpected discoveries I found about my mother, about the career and such, and then recounting, what went into her giving birth to me, and then ultimately arranging the adoption. But what it really distilled down to when it was all over was it was kind of a testimony to her courage, and to the strength that she had in reaching the decision that she did. And that's really stuck with me. And I've reached out. I've had contact with people in the adoption community and podcasts in the adoption community. And what really resonate with me, or who the people who truly resonate, are the birth mothers. They're the women who have struggle with decisions, make decisions, and then have to live with the aftermath. In some cases, they're great. Some places, very sad.
And I imagine for you, I mean, because you said you thought, well, maybe my mom got pregnant with me when she was in high school or whatever. So I'm sure as this journey went on for you, this was kind of like a major unfolding that, wow, so she was this person. I mean, it had to be just very eye-opening for you.
Well, yeah, if you think, okay, she was 17 years old, but then the first document I pulled up, she was 23. Yeah. So it was a different person at a different place and a different time. That first document I pulled up, by the way, was, and it was just kind of pick one off the page, was a visa application for her travel to Rio, the year after I was born. It had her picture on it. And I was like, holy cow, it wasn't a publicity picture, it was a passport kind of picture. And it was just, wow, there's my mother. It's, in real life.
Yeah. So I've enjoyed this conversation. Is there anything that you want to add to it that we didn't cover?
Well, I think we're all impacted one way or another, directly, or it's, probably not that far away by something to do with adoption. Somebody giving a child up, somebody taking a child in, and it's, I think it's a fact of life. I think I read this something like 1 out of every 4 families is somehow touched by adoption. So, it's probably worth a lot of conversation, when the topic comes up. It's, from a personal perspective, it was a great ride. I'm so pleased that I went on it at the time that I did. As you said, maybe it was when I was best ready for it.
Mm-hmm.
And, other than being able, having the opportunity to tell my mother that she had done something good and the results for what she would have hoped for, that there were no regrets. And you also alluded to secrets. Don't keep secrets. It just doesn't pay. If you're holding something in, share it with somebody. If you suspect there's a secret out there, ask the question. Mm-hmm. And with DNA, especially these days, that's it's probably better to have it all out on the table and to have it come back in an email from 23andMe or Ancestry, because that's where it turns real messy. Yeah, and that's where people get angry.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, dare I say, the affair, the illicit affair can suddenly come back to haunt you in a very big way.
Yeah, and I suppose, there's some places maybe it's better to not to say anything and hope for the best. But I think by and large, in most cases, it's just put it on the table and talk about it. And there's some great books out there that talk about the, that misattributed parentage discussion, and the impact it has on people.
One thing I want to add a little bit to what you were saying about adoption. I think in a way, stepkids go through that too. And I know that sounds, some people are going to be like, no, but for me as a step parent, my two kids did not see their mom for 3 years. So in a roundabout way, even though it wasn't legal, I adopted them because they called me mom. I was
Right.
their sole caregiver. So I think in a roundabout way, depending on your situation as a step parent, you become a surrogate parent, and that's an adoptive parent.
Right. There, yeah, and I think that's hard on the adoptive parent or the step parent. It's
Mhm.
hard on the natural mother, and it's hard on the kids. There's a there's that trauma of separation
Mhm.
and knowing that there's somebody else out there, and hopefully those the step parent relationships work for the best. But
That's not always the
there's
case.
no, it's not always the case, and under the best of circumstances, you still know. Yeah,
And and in some cases the adoption situation doesn't always work out well.
Oh no, it certainly doesn't. It's kind of sad. There are a number of adoption podcasts out there, and some of them have some very sad stories, not the way they were intended to be. But the adoptees, and these are people 40s, 50s, 60s who are still looking back and talking about how that whole process didn't work as it should have. I think we're getting a little bit smarter, but it's still, you got to make sure whatever you do is for the child and not for the parents.
Well, here's the interesting thing I want to say about that. Even if you're not adopted, not to discredit any adoption, you can be born and know your parents and still have a screwed up life.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Look around you.
I mean, not to make light of adoption, but I know who my parents were, and well, there's some things that I go, well, I wish it would
Yeah.
have been
Look at one
different.
side, look at the other. If it's not them, it's probably you.
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
you have to unpack things, and eventually you have to just figure out who you are.
Life gets messy.
That's how you
Yeah.
grow.
Yep. Yeah.
So,
Most of us overcome it, some don't.
yeah.
Yeah. But it's got to be dealt with.
Well, on that note, I thank you, Edward, for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, Donna, I enjoyed it. Thanks so much for inviting me to talk with you.
You're welcome. So, Edward's story, while, I've talked to another person about adoption before, and he had a harder journey. Edward's journey about being adopted was not so bad. And his unearthing of the fact that his mom was an ice skater and who his dad was, that his dad worked in insurance. I mean, he has this historical points. Plus, he got to find out a little bit about who they were, their circumstances. And, dare I say, when he was talking to me, Summer Lovin from Greece came to mind. But, I think it was a different time back then, and we hid secrets. And that's the one thing he said, and I would agree with. If you have a secret, a family secret, it can die with you, sure. But then this great mystery will linger on and linger on. So if it's not going to be too disruptive, it's better to share it, get it off your chest. The truth will set you free, as they say. And I think it's a pretty powerful thing. If we want to go back to talking about adoption is a great option. But, as he said, not every adoption story ends up with a happy ending. And as my prior guest talked about, it ended up for him leading to addiction. But that doesn't mean it has to be a bad thing. Just understand whatever choice somebody makes, that's their choice. It's their decision, it's their life. And you need to live your life and make your choices based on your expectations. You can't please everybody. And that kind of goes along the lines of making that choice. If you are a woman and you have this choice, in today's day and age, sure, you can sit there and say that somebody should have a baby. And I'm not saying that somebody shouldn't, but you also have to look at the ramifications of, can you support the child? Are you going to let this kid live in poverty? Is this kid only going to be able to have one meal? There are so many people now that want children, yes. And I'm not saying that abortion is the answer, and I'm not saying adoption is the answer, and I'm not saying keeping the child is the answer. The answer is a personal choice for whoever is listening. But I think it's a powerful statement that if you want to and you're willing to give the child up for adoption to another family that potentially can help, and they want a child, and for whatever reason they can't, then it's a blessing. But know that it's your choice and understand that. So, on that note, Edward's book is available on Amazon, and I will have links in the bio, as always, or show notes. And as always, if you like the show and you want to be a guest or you have comments, questions, reviews, whatever, you can email me at Donna, DAUNA, at better2podcast.com. That's Donna at better2podcast.com. We do have a website, www.better2podcast.com. We have social media links there, and you can follow us there and see what the latest episodes are. So I hope you have a wonderful day, and I guess I'll catch you next time. Bye, guys. Sound design and production by Rich Zai at Third Ear Audio Productions.